So welcome, as I said, to our School of Humanities, Languages and Social Sciences seminar series. Today we have Hannah Adler, one of our PhD candidates who has recently, I think, submitted, which is amazing. And the title of her presentation today is Medical Cannabis and Countervailing Powers, a study of news media, doctors and users in Australia. So Hannah Adler is a PhD candidate and member of the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research at Griffith University. Her research is interdisciplinary across communications and sociology, and her current PhD thesis investigates the framings of medical cannabis in Australia, in online news media, and the impact such framings have for doctors and users. She is also currently involved with endometriosis research, focusing on social media, language, and inclusivity. Hannah is also a member of the Menstrual Health Research Network, and in 2020 was awarded the Griffith University Medal along with her honours. So I will hand over to you, Hannah. We're really looking forward to hearing you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adele, for that introduction. So I will share my screen. Hopefully you can all see this when I start showing my PowerPoint in a second. Can everybody see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I shall get started then, shall I? Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to my presentation today. This is on my doctoral thesis, which is titled Medicinal Cannabis and Countervailing Powers, a study of news media, doctors and users in Australia. And I'm supervised by the amazing Professor Barbara Peeney and Senior Lecturer Monique Lewis. And I recently submitted my doctoral thesis last month, which is super exciting. So today I'm just going to talk over kind of the main points for my doctoral thesis and all the studies that made up that project. First, I'd like to acknowledge, though, that this research was conducted and written on Yugambeh land, which is where I reside and study on the Gold Coast. I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and that this continent always was and always will be First Nations land. So then why medicinal cannabis? So in my PhD research, I built on my honours research, which investigated the role of strategic communication surrounding medicinal cannabis legislative change in Australia. Using a narrative inquiry approach as my methodology, my honours focused on Lucy Haslam, who's an activist that emerged as a major figure for this change in legislation for cannabis. Lucy lobbied for legal access to medicinal cannabis for her son Dan, who at 20 years old was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer. Despite Dan passing away in 2015, Lucy continued her lobbying efforts, with this change of legislation for cannabis being known in Australia as Dan's Law. Reflecting on this, Lucy told me, "It wasn't any great plan. It was just, he was Dan, he was dying, and this gave him relief, and we have to be criminals if he's going to use it." And that just didn't seem right. I guess that's how it started. It wasn't, I'm going to have cannabis legalized or anything like that. I actually had no idea how big of a minefield it was. When I started, to me, it was just, I was a mum, he's my kid, and it's a way of ending his suffering. Simple. So Lucy then told me her story and how she contacted her local newspaper editor in Tamworth, and from there the Doing It for Dan campaign started. Lucy, alongside other caregivers and users, used news media, among other tactics, to successfully lobby for medicinal cannabis in Australia. While my honours research showed how news media was potentially a powerful force in medicinal cannabis legitimisation, it also raised other questions about cannabis news reporting and its impact. In my doctoral thesis, I took up these questions, exploring how medicinal cannabis has been framed in Australian online news, how these frames are co-produced and why journalists report on this topic, and the impact of these framings on two key groups, doctors who prescribe cannabis and people who use it. So these were the research questions for my doctoral thesis. So I had 4 main research questions. For the first one, I explored how did news media in Australia frame medicinal cannabis between 2014 to 2021. So that time frame included 2 years before cannabis was legalised in Australia and around the start of the current lobbying movements to the time of data gathering. Then I questioned how Australian journalists perceive and engage in news reporting about medicinal cannabis. And then what are Australian doctors' experiences of prescribing cannabis, and what are their experiences and opinions about news reporting on the topic? And then really similar, what are Australian users' experiences of medicinal cannabis, and what are their experiences of and opinions about news reporting on the topic? So to explore this, I had 4 studies. So the first was a content analysis where I investigated those news reports. And then subsequently, I had 3 studies, interviews with journalists, with prescribing doctors, and then with users. So before I get into, those studies, it's important to give a bit of a background on medicinal cannabis. So cannabis has a long history as a medicinal product dating back thousands of years, moving into British and American pharmacopoeia in the 19th century, but removed by 1942 due to prohibition in the era of reefer madness. In the late 20th century, however, the endocannabinoid system was discovered and phytocannabinoids gained more popularity in research, with the 2 most common being tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, and that has analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties, but is also the psychoactive constituent of cannabis, and cannabidiol, CBD, which has anticonvulsant, anti-inflammatory, and neuroprotective properties. So in line with parts of Europe, the US, and Canada, on the 1st November 2016, the TGA rescheduled some cannabis products from a Schedule 9 prohibited substance to a Schedule 8 controlled drug. This means medicinal cannabis is available via prescription in Australia through 2 pathways, and companies are also allowed to grow and manufacture cannabis here too. However, some barriers to access do remain, and these include the current cost of the product and driving laws. So also some background on my theoretical framework, which was countervailing powers. So as well as drawing on communications theory like framing and biocommunicability, my thesis utilizes countervailing powers to theorize medicinal cannabis-related healthcare in Australia as understood by news media, journos, users, and doctors. Light's theory of countervailing powers views healthcare as an arena where different actors vie for control, and it places the study of healthcare in a larger, pluralistic framework that acknowledges both institutional and cultural forces. There are a variety of studies that have used this theory that are helpful for my research, especially healthcare research, focusing on complementary alternative medicine, which is CAM, and interdisciplinary health media research. So as well as larger forces like doctors and state regulation, patients, the community, and news media can act as countervailing powers. Hartley extended this theory, specifically investigating how mass media may be an important countervailing power in healthcare, coming from the perspective that the news media play an important role in reflecting the balance of power among the various countervailing powers. The mass media provide a stage for different actors to define, articulate, and publicise their agendas, and therefore news media coverage can be conceptualised as a proxy measure of power, and possibly even a countervailing power in itself. However, Hartley investigated this from the American context, specifically focused on the coverage of pharmaceuticals in news media, as direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals is permitted in America. However, in Australia, prescription-based and certain pharmacy-only medicines are prohibited from being advertised directly to the public, but news media reporting is a bit of a murky grey area, and we're going to come back to this. So for this project, I reviewed literature in 3 key areas to gain a holistic insight into all the different topics that are relevant to my thesis. So the literature in the first section of my literature review drew on concepts such as medical dominance and the shifting doctor-patient interaction, with a specific focus on how CAM has contributed to this shift. This shift has also been accelerated by consumerism, which is underpinned by neoliberal ideologies. In response to this, as the literature uncovers, biomedicine has co-opted and integrated certain CAN therapies into practice in order to regain control. This has been the case for medicinal cannabis in Australia, given that cannabis is traditionally a herbal medicine, yet it is prescribed within the orthodox biomedical framework. So the section on health journalism research and news media and health considers how this neoliberal shift towards healthcare is impacting the practice of health news. It also canvasses other key concepts such as journalism practice in the 21st century. This section introduces concepts such as biocommunicability, a theory by Briggs and Hallen that understands how health issues are produced, circulated, and received by news audiences. However, it also explains that there's a lot of issues facing the journalism profession in the 21st century, such as staff cutbacks, a declining number of health journos, time pressures, limited resources, and the influence of PR materials. And these all impact the critical quality of health journalism, as journalists may become reliant on the information given to them by their sources. The final section of the literature review focuses on the literature on cannabis as a medicine. Key themes from this literature are that there are a lack of knowledge held by medical professionals globally on medicinal cannabis, and this includes in Australia. This impacts people who use medicinal cannabis who may face stigma from the medical profession and wider society due to their cannabis use. This is because cannabis exists within a diversity of relations, and that can actually be seen in news reporting about the plant medicine. While many international studies have uncovered how medicinal cannabis is framed in different geographical contexts, no research has investigated the framing of medicinal cannabis in Australia, an entry point for this thesis. So this is kind of an overview of the study design of my doctoral project. So working within an interpretivist epistemology, I utilised a mixed method design for my doctoral thesis. For study one, I analysed 300 online news reports published between 2014 to 2021 about medicinal cannabis, 150 from the ABC Online News, and the other 150 from a variety of News Corp publications aggregated by news.com.au. Drawing on the work of Entman, I conducted a framing analysis of the reports, while I also coded for other manifest units of data utilising in vivo for this process. For study 2, 3, and 4, I conducted semi-structured interviews over a 3-month period in 2022. For study 1, I interviewed 10 journalists, 5 who were health reporters and 5 general journalists. For study 2, I interviewed 10 general practitioners who prescribe cannabis, with the length of time they had been prescribing ranging from 6 years to 3 months across the data set. And for study 3, I interviewed 10 users of cannabis who were using for a variety of conditions, ranging from chronic pain to cancer to mental health. Once I completed my interviews, I transcribed them all and then completed a reflexive thematic analysis, which included a continual internal dialogue and critical self-evaluation of how I was constructing meaning from the data. I analysed each interview group separately and all make up a separate data chapter of my thesis. So for study 1, which is my content analysis, I found 35 different frames overall. So this study is also now published, as you can all see on your screens, in International Journal of Communication with my supervisor, Dr. Monique Lewis. However, my thesis chapter provides the original extended version, and today I'm going to discuss some key findings. So overwhelmingly, the most common frame within the data set, which appeared in 61% of reports, was medicinal cannabis is a legitimate therapeutic option. Rather than drawing on biomedical actors, claims of legitimacy were often from politicians, caregivers, and users, and rarely were they investigated by the journalist, and rather, stories took a more human interest angle. This frame often coalesced with another frame, which I coded as positive anecdotal evidence, and that occurred 109 times in the dataset, as individual success stories of usage were prolific in the news stories, and they were often seen to be functioning cannabis as a legitimate medicine. When we look at these stories, words like miracle or life-changing were often used to position cannabis as the hero for those who were sick. The people in these stories, who either themselves or their children, were suffering from conditions like chronic pain, cancer, and epilepsy. They were represented as genuinely ill people, a patient with a health condition in need of effective medical intervention, which in this case was medicinal cannabis. Not only does this functionalize cannabis as a legitimate medicine, but it leaves little room for questioning by the audience whether compassion is deserved. So 2 more common frames were political actor support or endorsement for medicinal cannabis and lobbying or advocacy for legislation or research. These frames often coalesce to show a system of alignment between certain politicians and activists. In extending the countervailing powers theory, Hartley writes that systems of alignments are observed when there is an interrelation among stakeholders to challenge traditional medical dominance, and policies are often evolved and shaped through this mutual interaction. This was seen in the news stories, particularly through the example of Lucy Haslam, a caregiver turned activist for medicinal cannabis, and the former Premier of New South Wales, Mike Baird. The word Haslam was found 92 times in the data set, and stories about Lucy often included comments from Baird supporting her lobbying for legal access for medicinal cannabis. So this lobbying actually continues to this day, with another common frame being current legislation is not adequate. A final frame I'd like to discuss is the frame of industry development opportunity or progress, which occurred 63 times across the dataset. A nuance here is that news articles were seen to be uncritically bracing cannabis as an economic opportunity, and the commercialisation of cannabis as a medical product was framed as a sense of development, both economically and for industry. This level of commercialisation was rarely critiqued by the journalist, which is a juxtaposition from my interview research, which we're now going to discuss. So, As I said before, I conducted 3 interview studies, and I interviewed journos, doctors who prescribe cannabis, and users. So there were 5 key themes in my journalist interviews, and I'm going to speak to the overall findings today. A common thread throughout, though, was that there was a lack of time and resources, that reporting on cannabis was viewed as uncritical, and that there was a dichotomy between general and health journalists. So a key finding from these interviews, which was discovered in the theme of uncritical reverence, a term coined by my supervisor Monique, is that journalists interviewed asserted that overall, reporting on medicinal cannabis is uncritical, which they perceived as detrimental to public opinion and understanding. They felt reporting did not canvass side effects, framed cannabis as a miracle, or was shock or breakthrough-oriented stories. Health journals in particular felt this way, which is summed up by a quote from one of my interviewees. A lot of it was very, what's the word? I think I used the word puff pieces, stuff that isn't particularly critical. So it doesn't really engage strongly with the science or the evidence around it, and it more kind of pretty lightly glosses over that stuff, and it might be driven, for example, by press releases from a medicinal cannabis company or someone trying to flog a product. A really significant finding of my journal interviews that is yet to be discussed in the literature is the influence of cannabis companies in news media reporting. I found that this group was trying to shape the media agenda, as explained by another journo who said she receives a quote-unquote nauseating amount of press releases from cannabis companies trying to sell products. This issue was mentioned multiple times in the interviews and cited by health journos as the most frustrating aspect to cannabis news reporting. However, I found there to be a dichotomy between health and general journalists, with general journos facing other barriers. General journals admitted that scientific research on medicinal cannabis are difficult topics to grasp. As another said, perhaps I was projecting a bit, but I don't have a scientific background. I don't have a strong sort of academic grasp on medicine or health. I suppose trying to understand why these products work, that's something I find challenging as a journalist. As explained by a plethora of journalism literature, aspects of medicine and health are usually better comprehended and accurately reported by specialised health reporters. However, these are few and far in between. And if we compare this to the results of my content analysis, only 16 articles of the 300 that I analysed were written by specialised health reporters. So this was furthered by the issue of time, another well-known barrier facing journos today. I found that it's this lack of time, coupled with the complexity of science and influence of cannabis companies, that led journos to admitting that they relied on sources when writing stories about medicinal cannabis. However, some journalists, and mainly health journalists, viewed their reporting on medicinal cannabis as more critical, as they engaged with scientific and academic literature and cited biomedical sources. Yet time was still an issue, and general journals outrightly admitted that they do not have the time to do this level of research, nor find independent expert sources when writing a story on medicinal cannabis. So for prescribing doctors, I constructed 6 themes from the interviews with a common thread of power and dominance evident throughout. So for that first theme, which is media effects, power and legitimacy, I found that all doctors had seen a digital news story about cannabis. They described the topics they'd seen, such as industry news, economics, patient stories, case studies, and just short little snippets. And they also used news stories to keep up with international trends. While they believed news media reporting plays a crucial educational role for the lay public who make up a large portion of their patient base, they felt this educational tool was not being properly utilised and that the cannabis industry has not been innocent here. Showing a high level of media literacy and echoing the concerns of the journos I interviewed, doctors expressed concerns around commercialised news reports. As one said, I think that it's unfortunate that some players may have reached out to media to plug their own story rather than for the betterment of the industry. They were worried such news reporting would create unrealistic expectations in patients, while also impacting their own reputation. As another doctor told me, so I can only imagine a doctor who doesn't believe in medicinal cannabis yet because they haven't seen enough data, how this will make them feel and how they will feel about me as someone who prescribes, because they put us all in the same category. In this quote, they is the wider medical profession. And this is the first indication of how stigma toward medicinal cannabis from the profession itself impacts prescribers, which was a key finding of my research. So then why are these commercialized reports happening? Well, if we remember advertising laws in Australia, the TGA does not permit direct-to-consumer advertising of any medicines, and doctors believed news reporting is a way of companies to sidestep those advertising rules by quote-unquote dressing things up as news. This process was described as prioritizing profits over patients, and that almost always patients suffer. In this sense, both news reports and certain cannabis companies act as a countervailing power which can impact the physician and their reputation. This was explored in other themes throughout, such as, those on the doctor-patient interaction. And in those themes, I looked at what micro-countervailing powers could be seen on that level. It was of interest to me that prescribing doctors supported self-autonomy in their patients, indicative of a neoliberalized consumerist approach where people take responsibility of their health. Yet, doctors also recall times where patients had demanded to be prescribed cannabis, which they did view as a countervailing power against their personal power. They also felt this demand could be fueled by news media reporting, as one doctor explained that people have got a certain idea of what medicinal cannabis can do and what it does, and they've just got the completely wrong message from what they've been viewing or listening to. These findings indicate that news media alone is not a threat to the doctor-patient relationship, but that the framings or perspectives in such reporting impacts audience schemas and expectations, reinforcing that news media play a dual role in giving stage to other countervailing powers, but also being a countervailing power in itself. I also found that doctors hypothesized that commercialized reports were happening as medical sources are few and far between in news reports about cannabis. They felt that stigma was to blame for this. I found that due to the marginalized position of cannabis in medicine, that those who prescribe are engaging in a practice outside of the discursive norms of the dominant profession, and that they usually have to protect their position at the apex of the healthcare pyramid. As one doctor said, I think that the GPs and specialists are very tight-lipped and protective of their reputation, and that due to the infancy of this space, it's difficult for doctors to put their neck out there. Another doctor concurred and brought this directly back to stigma. I think it's probably down to a lot of healthcare professionals not wanting to break ranks and, come out and visibly in favor of supporting it. Really, the clinical evidence for the use of cannabis is still developing. I still think that there's a lot of stigma within the profession about doing this kind of work. And I think it's probably that there might be a lot of doctors who are just kind of reluctant to talk about that so publicly for those reasons. In this sense, I found that to support medicinal cannabis in the media as a doctor is to break ranks, demonstrated how fragmenting countervailing powers within the profession impacts prescribers and their reputation and their voice in news media. This fragmented power also impacted them in their intraprofessional interactions with other doctors. Despite this, though, certain doctors that I interviewed had appeared in news media as a source for supporting medicinal cannabis. They viewed themselves as activists trying to decrease stigma and believed that it was helpful to be persistent with that mission, while recognizing how complex this space is and how other prescribers may not feel the same. Thus, biomedical power is not monolithic. So similar to doctors, my user interviews also included 6 key themes: discussions around stigma, self-autonomy, and the vulnerability of being a cannabis user were common threads throughout. Overall, I found that users demonstrated their knowledge of a fractured news landscape, where some news sources were viewed as countervailing powers in regard to medicinal cannabis and others not. Participants favoured cannabis-specific publications and SBS and ABC, and while they believed reporting was positive overall, they held the same concerns of journalists and doctors in regard to uncritical and overtly positive stories. This is exemplified in a quote by a user who said, "In my opinion, when I see it on the news, it's more or less treated as a novelty, and that's something that I don't like. And that's something where I say I don't learn anything from the news media because it's always a surprised inflection or you will never believe or something like that." And it's just like, let's be serious about this. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's have this frank discussion. Let's be honest in our reporting. Let's not be like, this miracle plant or something like that. Let's not be snake oil salesmen and let's not push an agenda here. So when this participant continued speaking, they brought this back to cannabis companies and the influence that they were worried these companies could be having on the media agenda. So this finding on cannabis companies and news media reporting is an important part of my project, and it positions both news media and certain cannabis companies as countervailing power against the legitimacy of medicinal cannabis. And it also demonstrates the complexity of news frames and the news construction process. So, what I found really interesting was that all interview groups were more concerned about the potential of cannabis companies causing uncritical reporting than positive anecdotes. Journos viewed anecdotes as an important element of health news with human interest news appeal, and GPs felt that anecdotes could help undo stigma. But users were the first group to bring this back to trust and that connection between authenticity and narrative. One user explained when they were referring and reflecting back on anecdotes in news reporting. I think it's making it real for people with real problems that might be able to get some help from medicinal cannabis. So maybe they can see their own stories in the stories in the articles and then be able to take steps to improve their lives. This contention is well documented in literature on narratives. And while drug scholars have emphasized issues with narrative driven reporting in relation to medicinal cannabis, journos, doctors, and users in my studies were far more concerned about cannabis companies being the driver for an uncritical acceptance of cannabis in news media. Despite users supporting narratives, I found that they were also hesitant to be a source in news stories, though, again worried about stigma, but this time from family, employers, and the general public. Despite medicinal cannabis becoming mainstreamed as a legitimate option in news media and the rise of prescriptions for medicinal cannabis in Australia, I found that patients and users still positioned medicinal cannabis as a stigmatized activity in many contexts, and they drew on passing and concealment as strategies to mitigate this. Stigma can be thought of itself as a countervailing power users must negotiate, especially when publicly supporting cannabis. This was made more complex by users who were using cannabis in the context of layered vulnerabilities, such as one participant who was a veteran and single mother, and therefore she said that I still feel sensitive as a patient being seen using my medicine. Despite this, though, she had appeared as a source in news media reports multiple times, and similar to doctors, I found that users often viewed themselves as advocates when publicly supporting cannabis, as they wanted to take control of the public narrative and help others. This was articulated by one user who said, I think people are worried about being judged as a drug addict because that's what I feel. Even if I'm out somewhere and it smells, the looks you get, the comments that people make against you for using it. I know certain people are afraid to use it in a public space because of the fact that they'll be judged and people still think it's an illegal drug and a gateway drug and all that stuff. So there needs to be people that talk about it and come out and say, hey, it's a medication, it's fine to use, and it's actually beneficial. The complexity of using cannabis, stigma, and a desire for control and autonomy were key ideas across all themes with users, impacting more than just their experiences with news media, but their experiences with friends, family, doctors, and wider society. One participant told me she is worried about being viewed as the weed house on the street, and many reflected on their experiences in the doctor-patient interaction where they had felt judged, stigmatized, and stereotyped. While I don't have time today to go into detail about all of these themes, the important takeaway is that they give insight into the complexity of cannabis use, the layered vulnerability people experience when using cannabis, and the inconsistency in cannabis-related healthcare in Australia. So overall, and through exploration of all those different data sets in my thesis, my research extends the writings of Lewis on plant medicines in Australia and argues that, like herbal medicines more broadly, cannabis is an ambiguous substance for those who use and prescribe it. This position is made more complex by news media framings, which have acted as both a support and countervailing power against medicinal cannabis. Some key findings of my research include that in Australian online news media, medicinal cannabis has been framed as a legitimate therapeutic option, while also giving evidence to the fact that cannabis is a bottom-up movement, led by users and caregivers whose voices are prominent in news stories. At the same time, the power of news media is fluid. It has acted as a support for medicinal cannabis, and now as a threat to the legitimacy of cannabis as a medicine due to commercialized reports. Thus, both news media itself and the claims makers in those reports can be conceptualized as a countervailing power. This, of course, relates to the fact that medicinal cannabis has been commercialized, both in news media and in practice. As cannabis companies engage with news media to flout advertising laws and promote their products and services through PR materials, power amongst cannabis prescribers becomes fragmented. Yet, these PR materials go uncriticized in the literature that critiques the quality coverage of medicinal cannabis news stories. Another interesting finding that relates to power is that the use of cannabis as a medicine is a process of reflexive self-management, indicative of a neoliberalistic healthcare framework. However, this is not necessarily a countervailing power against physician autonomy, as doctors who prescribe cannabis demonstrate a level of integrated medical expertise, where they incorporate patient and biomedical knowledge into their practice. Finally, my research expands the literature on cannabis stigma and argues that cannabis is a drug with an emotional life of fear and stigma for both users and, importantly, prescribers. As medicinal cannabis becomes mainstreamed, it has not become normalized due to the existence of stigma on the intraprofessional, interprofessional, personal, and social level. This stigma is made more complex for people using in the context of layered vulnerabilities and for doctors as they engage in a herbal practice which exists outside of the norm of evidence-based medicine. So, throughout providing that holistic overview of the mediation of medicinal cannabis in Australia, this thesis provides an important example of the mainstreaming of medicinal cannabis and thus the renegotiation of cannabis as a medicine. It demonstrates how claims makers, newsmakers, doctors, and users of medicinal cannabis have worked to redefine cannabis and renegotiate the plant as a distinct medical object. Practically, this thesis and its findings can be considered a case study for the mainstreaming process of substances like cannabis, which include a history of illicit use and vilification. This is important given that more medicines like cannabis are slowly entering the mainstream, such as MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin. And as argued by my research, news media is salient in the process. The way news media reports on these medicines and how claims makers communicate them has repercussions for users and prescribing medical professionals, and thus careful consideration is needed. The use of PR materials and the co-production of news about cannabis and other drugs also needs to be considered, given the influence they have on news frames. By investigating this and bringing these issues to the forefront, they may be more carefully managed for other substances, which are also multi-layered through social, political, cultural, and economic meanings, but are earlier in the mainstreaming process. At the same time, my thesis provides a theoretical contribution about the role of news media and countervailing powers framework. I found that the news media acts as a stage for other countervailing powers to use, while also being a power in itself, and it holds macro and micro influence. Further research that engages with news media as a countervailing power needs to address how news media as an actor carries both these macro and micro effects, as has been found by my research. News media is not absent in the structure of power for these substances, but ever so important, and it needs to be considered rather than ignored. At the same time, countervailing powers research has often ignored the power structures between doctors who hold relatively the same level of power. I found that by co-opting cannabis into the biomedical framework, biomedicine has retained its power overall, but the individual power of the prescribing physician is impacted. The doctor is not one group, and this must be considered within the countervailing powers framework in relation to CAM and herbal medicines, especially in the case of co-option. So, in conclusion, my research untangles the power relations embedded in medicinal cannabis prescribing and usage and places them in a larger social context which considers and investigates news media frames of medicinal cannabis to understand the drug's mainstreaming and legitimisation in Australia. As other marginalised drugs enter the mainstream, the path paved by medicinal cannabis has been named, located, and explored by my doctoral thesis. Thank you. The end.